I normally have a habit of telling my friends when they ask me how I am that as ever I am physically well and mentally ill. Today some of you will have noticed I have to say the opposite. I have the mental clarity to know that this is my fourth visit in Ottawa. I feel very privileged, very grateful, very delighted to be back here. It's a privilege to me to be surrounded by so many friends. Friendships that have been built up over 20 years, and not least of all to be introduced by Robert Amsterdam, who I've always used to see at diplomatic receptions and at Chatham House round table. The question on all of your minds is clearly this. What can we expect of Russia's relations with Ukraine after Putin's recent victory? Notice I have not said victory in what. The first thing we need to understand is what is not going to change. Unless and until there is a revolution in thinking and practice in Ukraine, Russia is going to remain a country which by and large regards Ukraine's independence as a historical aberration and an anti-Russian geopolitical project. Ukraine for Russians is part of Russia's identity. The axiom, St. Petersburg is the brain, Moscow the heart, Kiev the mother of Russia, has a lasting resonance in Russia. And therefore, however Ukrainians might view the relationship, when it comes to Ukraine, Russians genuinely do not understand the charge of neo-imperialism because they regard Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians as one and the same people. This is not a sentiment confined to the current regime, to President-elect Putin, although he feels these things, as does President Medvedev, with a particular passion and intensity. Be no doubt about that. It is a sentiment shared by very large numbers of Russian liberals who abominate the Putin system, but who are absolutely faithful to Vernadsky's axiom that democracy ends where the question of Ukraine begins. It was Alexei Navalny recently in Ukraine, of all places, who said very publicly on television, we are practically speaking one and the same people. Один и тот же народ. Russia under Putin has been devoting itself in Ukraine first and foremost to identity politics. This is multi-dimensional. It is focused, it is very aggressive, there has been very little pushback to it. And it is not something that has really been noticed abroad. This is certainly not going to diminish. If there were this revolution in thinking and practice in Ukraine, given all of this emotional and ideological, cultural, historical baggage, you could see what substantial implications this would have for the character of Russia itself. And knowing that, you can understand that Ukraine's future course is as much a vital interest to Russia, almost as much a vital interest to Russia as it is to Ukraine itself. Do not underestimate now that Mr. Putin is coming back to the presidency, the States, and in the end, the risks that will probably be run. My first point. Secondly, the atmosphere, the geopolitical framework in Europe, as Russians see it, has become harder, tougher, more Darwinian. In the 1990s, Russians had a generally positive view about the strengthening of the European Union because they saw the European Union as, first and foremost, a geopolitical counter to NATO and the United States. Over the past 10 years, they now correctly understand that the EU is first and foremost a project and a mechanism of integration on the basis of a socio-political and economic model that is in many respects incompatible with that which has been developing and maturing and in many respects mutating, not only in Russia, but in most of the post-Soviet world. This model, that post-Soviet model, is network-driven rather than market-driven. Its ethos, it is not motivated by an ethos of competitiveness, but monopoly. It is not founded on property rights and judicial integrity, but on patron-client relationships, on a negotiable legal order, and on privileged relations between business structures of power at every level. And it is a model that is also based on money. Lots of money, which is used not only to keep certain networks in being where they are and strengthen them, but expand them abroad, outside the former Soviet Union, and undermine the ethos and the regulatory structures and mechanisms of the European Union. And therefore, this relationship between these two models of business, of economics, is not something that can be confined to Ukrainian bilateral relations. It affects all of Europe. The Russian fears that the EU was building a new post-war type of Iron Curtain, which was moving east. They are now seeking to move it west. And the fact that Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania are now part of NATO and the EU is not seen by them at this point as much of a restraint and deterrent. And that is the second reality, and the reality is magnified by the fact that this particular economic system is also Ukraine's economic system. The failure of the Orange Tandem to understand this, to address it, to make this a top priority, preserved when the tandem was in power Ukraine's greatest vulnerability. Now Yanukovych is strengthening it. Is he strengthening it to help Russia? No. He's strengthening it to help himself. President Yanukovych is doubtlessly someone who would prefer that Ukraine have an association agreement with the EU than that it be a member of the Russian-dominated CIS customs union. But he would rather be president of the Ukraine that is joining the customs union than not be president of the Ukraine that is joining the EU. And that priority and that scheme of preferences needs to be understood. Now let's look forward. Today, Vladimir Putin feels very strong, and he has reason to. And I hate to say it, but I think it would be realistic of us to accept that as unsettling and impressive as it was, the present wave of opposition in Russia has crested. But at the same time, Vladimir Putin, even he knows, and we have to know, that the next presidential term is not going to be like the last. First of all, he can already sense he's become President Discussant. The Teflon has worn off. The illusions have worn off. Lines are now drawn in Russia in a way they weren't before. They have become much more sharpened. Secondly, and I say this without prejudice to the fact that one of this world's principal experts will be speaking in the next session on this, the economic trends and the dynamics in Russia are not favorable at present. They are not good. And thirdly, the entire socio-economic model itself will find itself under real threat if, as is possible, at some point over the next 5 years, the oil price falls below $80 a barrel and stays there. So, the first question is, when will these strains become apparent to those who today feel so strong? The second uncertainty which we have to consider is how then will this system react when it is under strain? And here, we need to be one step ahead. Because there is a history in Russia and the Soviet Union for how you react when you're under pressure. And it's not a history of, it's not a course of incremental retreat. It's a course of resourcefulness and maneuver and using retreat to regain the offensive and unbalanced and divide opponents. So what do I mean? Putin himself not only understands, he's a master of the art not only of penetrating opposition, but of creating opponents. Creating opponents who can be co-opted later, who can confuse the issue. Ask yourself what the reaction will be in the West, in Washington, in Brussels, in London, and other places, if towards the end of this year, Dmitry Medvedev was palpably incapable of managing the national economy, particularly when it's under strain, is politely thanked for his services, and Alexei Kudrin, a consummate professional, a very principled individual, is brought back. He is a principled individual and a consummate professional. He is also a very robust critic of the current macroeconomic policies. But he is also what the Russians call a cooperativny человек. He has said very little against the real sinews that make this system what it is, the hidden regime of preferences and privileges that connect power and money in Russia. When he comes back and the West then decides, as it almost certainly will, Putin is back on the reformist path. What are people in this room going to be doing? What are they going to be doing before? There's a very good chance of it happening. There's a bigger uncertainty and a bigger reality we need to prepare ourselves for. It's this. The system in Russia is much bigger than Putin. Just as it was bigger than any leader in the Soviet Union, with the arguable exception of Stalin. The 100 billionaires in Russia, look at the organizational charts set up by all the Russian political scientists of people who really hold power in Russia. 50 to 100 people. Half to two-thirds of these people are people the West has never even heard of. But they're there. Half of them think. They are thinking about themselves and their future. They want to see that system preserved. But there are already people thinking. And we can treat this as a certainty. That if Putin is unable to regain the initiative and maintain it, they have to think beyond Putin. And in this context, I would suggest that you look very carefully at Alexei Navalny, and you start looking at some other figures who are so extremely attractive. And again, then ask when this happens, what the Western response will be. Because I assure you, the Russians have already pre-programmed much of that response. Now, my last point. What are the implications for Ukraine? We know perfectly well, first of all, several things. Ukrainians understand better than most. Gazprom is not a business, it is a power. And from the very beginning, that power has been used, certainly most conspicuously under Putin. That power, the whole energy issue, has been linked to deeper geoeconomic and political questions. It is now. And because the Russians have felt in such a strong position over this, because not just Yanukovych, but before him, Ukraine generally has so damaged itself in the energy sphere by a record of malpractice that has hurt the country at least as seriously as anything Russia has done to it. And Yushchenko played, I'm sorry to say, a very direct role in this in 2006 and afterwards. They feel in a very strong position, and so far they have been handling all this in a very subtle way. But there's one exception. If you look outside Ukraine, the exception is the South Stream pipeline. And please note that what we all thought of as a virtual project is now looking like something which is going to be built. And it is going to be built because of the type of energy and the type of resources that an individual like Putin knows how to concentrate on the impossible and the ineffective and unworkable, through inducement, through bullying, and through sheer force of will. How is Russia going to respond to events in Ukraine as the strains inside Russia mount and become more serious? Well, a serious expert should not make predictions, but I'm going to be rash and make one. I think there is a very strong chance that when it comes to Ukraine, in this presidential term, Russia will go for closure. And there is one riddle in all this, which I look forward to discussing in the next panel rather than now, is how the Polish-Russian reset will play out in this design. Because although the Poles understand what they are doing, the Russians also understand here what they are doing. And for them, this is a diplomatic revolution, and I think their own views about it need to be understood and considered without illusion and embellishment. My time is up, ladies and gentlemen. Rather than add a number of recommendations, I think this might be the gracious moment for me to close and to turn the floor over to my old friend and sometime colleague, Andrei Piontkovsky. And thank you very much indeed for your attention.